War is always terrible, and the wives and women of war veterans have suffered in every war. But in some important aspects, the experience of World War II wives is different from the experience of Vietnam wives. From the Foxhole to the Fireplace presents a brief comparison of those experiences. The attack on Pearl Harbor was an event that really brought the United States together. Mabel Wiggins, World War II veteran wife, tells that in those days you really didn't let yourself worry too much about your husband being overseas, because everybody else was in the same boat, going through the same thing, and you wouldn't let yourself get down. Everybody had to make sacrifices during World War II. To make all Americans feel involved with the war effort, programs such as buying war bonds, rationing, and volunteering were used. But in the Vietnam War, everything was different. No one had to make the sacrifices that they did in World War II. But in World War II, the country was behind the soldiers, and this helped them readjust better to civilian life.
Says she's not going to write anymore. Friends at college told her it was immoral to write to me.
The divisions the Vietnam War caused in America were too powerful. Some people thought that they were fighting against communism, while others thought it supported a corrupt government and was killing innocent civilians. Robert Mason, a Vietnam veteran, continually saw student demonstrators shouting that soldiers were wrong to go to Vietnam.
During the Vietnam War, there was no support from the country. The country was totally divided on their opinions of what we needed to be doing over there, whether we needed to be there or not.
The America of the 40s differed from the America of the 60s and early 70s. In the 1940s, the country was enjoying the benefits of a good economy and a feeling of national optimism. In the 1960s, the economy was suffering and the nation was divided on several cultural issues, including civil rights, racial discrimination, and the hippie movement. The soldiers from World War II came back home after the war in troop ships. Sometimes voyages back to the U.S. lasted about 2 weeks, allowing the soldiers to organize their thoughts and feelings. Decompression and debriefing was important in a soldier's homecoming. Chuck Dean, a Vietnam veteran, says that a typical World War II soldier returned to America with many other soldiers onto troop ships. Because it was a long journey, the soldiers had time to talk about their problems and sort out their emotions. All got off the ship at one location. The process, in the words of Chuck Dean, was their decompression chamber. Then many were received with ticker tape and music, and this welcome brought some closure to their war experience. Many aspects of their return helped the combat men from World War II to adjust to family life more easily than their Vietnam counterparts.
And even though they didn't have the big parades and everything to receive the people, everyone was so proud of the soldiers that made it back. And so they did get a lot of support from the people.
We lived out in Oklahoma. Everyone was very supportive of the war and did what they could to help the war effort and each other. People bought war bonds and performed volunteer services. Almost everyone had a loved one in the war. In contrast, the Vietnam soldier was pulled from combat by helicopter, taken out of Vietnam, and flown back to the United States in a relatively short time.
When James came home from Vietnam, he came by himself. Just the same way he went over, they were by themselves. You know, there were no big ticker tape parades, there was no big groups, no bands playing, nothing.
The soldiers were greeted by hostility and indifference. The country's hate for the war had turned the soldiers into outcasts.
In the World War II, the veterans were welcoming to America, but in Vietnam War, they came here in a hostile environment.
Many Vietnam veterans were bitter about their treatment when they returned home because they felt they had simply done what they were required to do, just as soldiers in previous wars had done.
You know how when Army and soldiers came back from World War I, World War II, and we met them with ticker tape parades and the bands and everything. When my brother came home, there was nothing. And I really think that had a lot to do with his not being able to be himself when he came back, because those war veterans of previous wars, they talked about their experiences proudly, and they got all kinds of honors and accolades from their hometowns. My brother got nothing from my hometown.
Charles E. Figley, a specialist on war trauma, argues that a major factor behind the problems experienced by Vietnam vets is that the soldiers couldn't be fighting in the war one day and then the next day be home already. They were still in combat mode when they came home. When the Vietnam veterans returned, there was no plan in place to help them re-enter civilian life. When the U.S. defeated Japan and World War II came to an end, the entire nation celebrated with great joy. 292,131 Americans were killed in World War II. Thousands came home wounded either physically or emotionally. But the great triumph helped America overcome its tragic losses. The nation's government and economy were in one piece and poised for progress. Among the most common sources of stress for Vietnam vets are the impression that the war was pointless, their lack of trust for their own government, and the humiliation of being branded as losers.
I do believe that the outcome of having lost the Vietnam War plays a big role in how James was able to assimilate back into the country. He's bitter about having gone over there and, with the best of intentions, and yet coming home knowing that they weren't wanted there, that it was just a political ploy.
Not all was bitterness and pain. Some Vietnam veterans received kindness and compassion when they returned to the United States. The majority of Vietnam veterans, despite their negative image, were able to successfully re-enter civilian life. In all wars, the intensity of combat leaves mental and emotional wounds on many of the soldiers and their families, wounds for which they don't receive a Purple Heart. Wives and relatives of Vietnam veterans notice that the soldiers changed dramatically because of their war experience.
James and I were married before he went over, and he was very caring, very sensitive to my feelings, but in Vietnam he learned to tell the new guys coming in, I don't want to know you, I don't want to know your family, don't show me pictures. When he came home from Vietnam, he told me the same thing. I don't want to know you, I don't want to know your opinions, I don't want to know your feelings.
When he came home, he was not the person that went because of things he experienced there, saw there, did there.
When I married my husband, I was a happy person, and after marrying him, I was living with him his nightmares, but I am trying to help him with all my heart, and the result is I didn't have anything left for me.
The wives and women of war veterans always had to pay a high price for the men's service, but that sacrifice was especially costly in the wake of the Vietnam War because the nature of the conflict, the divisions in the home front, the lack of decompression, the way the soldiers came back, and the final defeat made re-entry to civilian life very difficult for many combatants. And so, the wives became veterans of another war that, in many cases, has yet to end.